The heavy iron door of the intake chute scraped against the stone floor with a dry, metallic screech, followed by the dull, echoing clank of a stainless steel gurney locking into position at the bottom of the gravity-fed lift. I didn't lift my foot from the iron treadle immediately. I kept the needle buried deep inside a fold of white cotton, my right hand holding the fabric taut against the throat plate while the internal flywheel spun down with a long, dying whir. Have you ever experienced that sudden, bone-chilling drop in temperature when an intake arrives from the autopsy suite above without a single word of warning from the orderlies? Knowing full well that you are locked down in a restricted basement where nobody is supposed to walk after midnight? People always talk about morgues as places of clinical finality. Quiet, sterile rooms where doctors complete their paperwork and bodies are catalogued with respectful detachment before being handed over to grieving families. They imagine orderly hallways, bright fluorescent lights, and the reassuring presence of medical staff managing the transition from life to peace. They do not know the unnatural, suffocating dread of working in a basement sublevel where footsteps overhead sound muffled and distant, leaving you entirely alone with the acoustic anomalies of a building built on top of a century's worth of unclaimed sorrows. They do not know what it feels like when your heart hammers against your ribs because you can hear the heavy rubber wheels of a stretcher rolling across the concrete floor upstairs. Even though the shift log explicitly stated no more arrivals were scheduled until dawn. I slowly lifted my foot off the iron pedal, pushed my wooden stool back with a soft scrape, and stood up from the cutting table, my joints cracking in the heavy, humid air of the room. The hallway outside the workshop was empty. No night shift orderly coming down to drop off paperwork or share a cup of black coffee from the staff room. Only a fresh, white-bordered intake card resting squarely on top of the stainless steel drop table, held down by a heavy iron paperweight shaped like a skull. Think about how much confidence we place in our physical barriers and institutional routines. Believing that as long as we keep ourselves locked inside a building guarded by municipal codes, the tragedies of the city upstairs cannot invade our private workspaces. We lock our basement doors, we punch our time cards, and we tell ourselves that the dead brought down the elevator shaft are just medical specimens. Cases to be measured, stitched, and forgotten by morning. We believe that time and linen are enough to wrap up human suffering into neat, sanitary packages that can be hauled away by cemetery trucks before the sun comes up. Then an unscheduled intake card lands on your table without a signature to explain who pushed the gurney down. And you realize your workshop is just a waiting room for things that refuse to stay still. I walked slowly across the concrete floor, my boots echoing off the damp stone walls, and picked up the intake card under the sickly amber glow of the hanging work lamp. The cardboard was stiff and clean, smelling sharply of fresh ink and chemical antiseptic. The typewritten header on the card read simply, "County intake, unclaimed male, EST age 30s, cause of death, undetermined trauma." Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would remain steady if you walked over to an intake gurney and saw your own home address scrawled across the coroner's tag in grease pencil? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. I set the card down, turned back toward the vintage Singer machine, and pulled a fresh 20-yard bolt of heavy white cotton across the oak cutting table, preparing to measure out the longest shroud of the night. The iron door of the intake chute swung open with a slow, grinding groan that rattled the dry, choking dust off the overhead rafters and sent a sudden, piercing shudder through the damp masonry. A single zinc transit box slid out from the lift, its heavy metal surface gleaming dully under the jaundiced, flickering glare of the amber work lamp like a predatory eye opening in the dark. Have you ever experienced that sudden, sickening, lung-crushing contraction of the chest when a heavy metal container slides into a room, and you know with a terrifying, agonizing certainty before looking that it wasn't meant for any ordinary patient, but for something far worse? People always talk about transit boxes as mere tools of transportation, durable zinc cases designed to seal bodies safely during transit between municipal hospitals and the city cemetery, offering a cold, sterile sanctuary from the decay of the world. They imagine secure latches, airtight rubber gaskets, and standard municipal protocols that ensure every case is handled with detached, clinical, bureaucratic efficiency. They do not know the suffocating, mind-shattering claustrophobic dread of hearing a zinc lid slowly vibrate from the inside, as if the cold air trapped within were expanding against the metal walls, groaning under the unseen weight of a desperate, trapped breath. They do not know what it feels like when your fingers tremble uncontrollably over the latch, knowing that opening the box means breaking the seal on something the city tried very hard to bury, hide, and violently forget. I reached out, my trembling fingers brushing against the ice-cold, beaded surface of the metal lid that seemed to radiate a sinister, bone-chilling frost. The latch was sealed with a thick glob of weeping red municipal wax, stamped with an old Philadelphia County seal that hadn't been officially used in decades, dripping down the zinc flank like fresh gore. Crack. The dry wax gave way under my thumb with a sharp, violent snap, shattering into small, vicious crimson fragments that scattered across the damp concrete floor like freshly spilled blood drops. I gripped the freezing steel handle with all my remaining strength and violently pulled the heavy lid upward against its groaning hinges. Think about how desperately we rely on official seals and locked lids to convince ourselves that the past is safely buried, locked away in metal boxes where it can never crawl back out into the light to devour us. We trust the bureaucratic stamps, we trust the lifeless paperwork, and we tell ourselves that once a case is sealed in zinc, it ceases to be our terrifying problem. We believe that order and administrative routine are walls strong enough to keep the unburied, mutilated secrets of a city from returning to haunt the workshop floor. Then you break the wax on an unclaimed transit box and find an empty, blood-stained linen shroud folded inside, perfectly tailored to your exact height, waiting to swallow you whole. The interior of the zinc box was completely empty, save for the neatly folded 20-yard length of unbleached cotton and a single, heavy steel tailor shear resting in the center like a lethal, gleaming instrument of execution. No breathing body. No paperwork inside the liner to explain the madness. Just my own spare pair of reading glasses, the ones I had lost in the pitch-black sub-basement 3 winters ago, stained with a dark, suspicious patina, resting neatly on top of the open shears. Look down at your own shaking hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rotting rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep sorting through municipal supplies if you found your own lost belongings waiting inside an unassigned transit box, mocking your fragile existence? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the bleeding edges of an inevitable, terrifying exit into the dark. As I reached into the freezing zinc container to retrieve my glasses, the intake lift behind me groaned again with a deafening metallic screech, dropping a second, far heavier box onto the floor to seal my fate. The second zinc box hit the lower intake landing with a dull, echoing, chest-compressing thud that shook the dry dust loose from the limestone rafters overhead, sending a sharp wave of vibration straight through the soles of my boots. Unlike the first container, this one did not slide smoothly out of the steel shaft. It jammed halfway across the metal lip of the lift with a vicious screech of friction, its rusted edge catching violently on a protruding bolt, rocking back and forth in the dark amber gloom like a loose tooth in a swollen, bleeding jaw. Have you ever experienced that hyper-focused, paralyzing terror when an inanimate object gets stuck in a mechanism, and every microscopic vibration makes you certain with sickening clarity that whatever is trapped inside is about to tear its way out in a frenzy of violence? People always talk about mechanical malfunctions as simple nuisances, a jammed drawer, a stuck elevator door, or a malfunctioning conveyor belt that requires a quick wrench and a heavy shove. They imagine that machinery is predictable, devoid of intent, and completely separate from the human fears projected onto it. They do not know the gut-twisting, suffocating panic of standing entirely alone in a subterranean morgue, watching a heavy municipal transit box shudder against a steel lift while a low, wet, rhythmic rattling sound echoes from beneath its zinc lid like a heartbeat waiting to stop. They do not know what it feels like when the machine refuses to cooperate because it knows you aren't finished with your measurements yet, and it wants you to suffer for every second of the delay. I didn't reach for the heavy iron crowbar leaning against the workshop wall. My fingers stayed glued to the edge of the oak cutting table, my nails digging so deep into the rough wood that splinters pierced my skin while the box above me gave one final, violent lurch and dropped free onto the floor with a deafening metallic clang that rang in my ears. The red municipal wax on this second lid wasn't stamped with an old Philadelphia seal. It was fresh, pliable, and smeared with blue tailor's chalk that matched the exact toxic powder I had been using to mark my hems all night, glowing under the light like a trail left by something crawling. Think about how deeply we invest our trust in the physical boundaries of our workspaces, believing that a locked door, a heavy table, and a routine set of tools can shield us from the things we'd rather not name. We draw our straight lines with chalk, we measure our cloth down to the quarter-inch, and we tell ourselves that precision is the ultimate defense against chaos. We believe that as long as our measurements are accurate, our world remains orderly and safe. Then a box arrives bearing your own workshop dust, and you realize every line you ever drew was just pointing toward this exact corner of the room, acting as a guide for whatever is coming to claim you. I walked slowly toward the fallen zinc box, my boots crunching over the sharp fragments of crimson wax from the first container like stepping on broken bone. The metal lid was already vibrating fiercely, the red seal melting away under an invisible, blistering heat that smelled faintly of scorched wool and old paper burning in a void. I reached down, gripped the rusted edge of the zinc with trembling hands, and pulled. The lid lifted with a long, agonizing shriek of tearing metal that cut through the silence like a butcher's knife, revealing a second shroud inside, this one already half-stitched with thick crimson thread that pulsed in the dark like living arteries. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep measuring and marking if you saw your own initials embroidered along the hem of an unrequested shroud, mocking your mortal terror? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable exit. As the lid fell away completely, the half-stitched shroud began to unravel itself, its red threads pulling loose one by one to spell out a single word across the concrete floor in letters of blood, next. The single word spelled out across the concrete floor began to dissolve in a sickening, unnatural manner. The crimson threads curled upward into the damp, poisoned air like wisps of greasy smoke from a burning corpse. Then vanished entirely into the crawling limestone shadows that seemed to pulse with malicious life. I stared down at the empty, barren space where the glowing letters had just been, my chest tightening into a hard, painful knot. My breath caught sharply in my throat, choking off any sound as absolute panic gripped my lungs. The cold basement air turned heavy, thick, and utterly stagnant, smelling sharply of wet iron and oncoming death. Have you ever experienced that complete, paralyzing, mind-fracturing disorientation when a physical message written right in front of your dilated eyes disappears without a single trace? Leaving you to wonder with agonizing horror if your own sanity is finally shattering under the crushing weight of the endless night shift. People always talk about hallucinations as fleeting tricks of the light or tired eyes playing harmless games in the dark. They imagine that a rational human being can simply shake off a fright, splash some cold water on their sweating face, and return to work as if nothing terrifying ever happened. They do not know the soul-crushing, terrifying reality of standing alone in a room where the physical environment actively alters itself to mock and torture your fracturing sanity. Erasing its own horrifying evidence just to leave you violently doubting your own eyes and mind. They do not know what it feels like when the solid floor beneath your boots suddenly loses its substance. Instead feeling like a perilously thin crust of cracking ice over a bottomless, black well of madness. I turned my trembling back on the fallen zinc box, terrified of what might be reaching out from the dark. I walked slowly toward my scarred workbench, every step feeling like a march toward an executioner block. My boots made a soft, rhythmic padding sound against the damp, blood-slicked concrete floor. The vintage Singer machine sat dead in the center of the oak table, radiating a palpable aura of dread. Its heavy iron handwheel completely still, yet vibrating with unseen tension. Its sharp steel needle poised a menacing quarter-inch above the unbleached cotton shroud like a poised fawn. My wooden stool was pulled out slightly from the table. As if someone heavy had just abruptly stood up from it in a desperate hurry, leaving the seat warm. Resting precisely on the center of the seat was my discarded carpenter's pencil. And a pair of cold, steel-rimmed reading glasses waiting like a trap. Think about how stubbornly and pathetically we cling to the fragile illusion of control. Believing that as long as we keep our tools in order, our chairs tucked in, and our schedules maintained, we remain the masters of our own domain. We sit rigidly at our desks. We pick up our pens with shaking fingers. We tell ourselves that our daily routines are bulletproof armor against the horrors of the unknown. We desperately believe that familiarity is safety. And that a room we have occupied for years can hold no unexpected, flesh-tearing horrors. Then you find your personal belongings deliberately moved to a chair you haven't touched in hours. And you realize with a jolt of pure terror that you are sharing your claustrophobic workspace with an invisible, predatory occupant who knows your habits better than you know them yourself. I reached out with a trembling hand, my muscles rigid with revulsion. And picked up the freezing reading glasses. The cold metal frames were chillingly icy, almost burning to the touch. Drawing the remaining heat straight out of my fingertips the instant I made violent contact. As I held them up to the sickly amber glow of the hooded work lamp, I noticed something horrifying etched deep into the glass of the right lens. A tiny, microscopic, perfectly carved 6-digit serial number. The exact same gruesome 6-digit intake code printed on the unclaimed card from the first zinc box of the night. Look down at your own shaking hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep holding an object if you discovered your own secret identification number brutally engraved onto the glass you used to see? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the bleeding edges of an inevitable, terrifying exit. Before I could violently set the cursed glasses down, the vintage Singer machine clicked softly with a mechanical malice. Its internal gears violently shifted on their own as the heavy iron foot treadle began to pump up and down once more in the dark, waiting for my blood. The heavy iron foot treadle of the vintage Singer machine rose and fell in a steady, metronomic, soul-crushing rhythm that hammered directly against the frantic beating of my heart. Its heavy metal link chain clinked softly against the splintered wooden base like the rattling of bone chains in a deep dungeon. Clack. 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 No human hand was turning the grease-slicked handwheel. No electric motor or hidden current was humming beneath the trembling bench to explain the blasphemy. Have you ever experienced that chilling, absolute certainty when an inanimate machine starts running entirely on its own, driven by a malevolent, unseen will? Operating with a predatory purpose and a terrifying mechanical precision that suggests an invisible operator has just stepped into your place to carve your doom. People always talk about machinery as lifeless, obedient tools of human labor. Cold assemblies of iron, steel, and oil that remain utterly inert until a flesh and blood hand gives them motion. They imagine that a broken belt, an unpowered motor, or an idle pedal means the apparatus is safe, dormant, and entirely under human control. They do not know the gut-twisting, lung-collapsing horror of watching a heavy cast-iron treadle pump up and down in an empty, echoing room. While a razor-sharp steel needle hammers furiously through a bolt of unbleached cotton with violent, murderous speed. They do not know what it feels like when a mechanical device decides it no longer needs you to complete its work, because you are no longer the master, you are the prey. I stood completely paralyzed beside the scarred oak cutting table, my breath trapped in my throat like glass. My fingers still desperately clutching the freezing metal frames of my reading glasses until my knuckles turned bloodless and white. Watching the gleaming needle vanish and reappear in a blinding silver blur of relentless agony. The coarse white fabric was moving across the throat plate at high, unnatural speed, dragged by unseen hands. Drawn forward by the internal feed dogs with a smooth, silent, horrifying efficiency that defied every law of physics. And running straight down the center of the cloth was a thick, wet, pulsing line of heavy crimson thread. It didn't look like ordinary cotton sewing thread, it was thick, wet, and sickeningly organic. It caught the sickly amber glow of the overhead lamp with a slick, glossy, repulsive sheen. Spreading a faint, suffocating, coppery warmth of fresh blood across the freezing, dead air of the room. Think about how blindly and foolishly we trust the equipment we use every single day to sustain our lives. Convinced that our tools are mere extensions of our will, obediently serving our labor hour after hour in safety. We oil the rusted joints. We replace the dull needles. We tell ourselves that as long as we keep our hands on the physical controls, we are the ones directing the outcome. We believe that labor is safe, predictable, and entirely separate from our own grim mortality. Then a machine starts stitching an unrequested, blood-soaked garment in the dead of the night. And you realize with a jolt of sheer terror that you are no longer the operator. You are simply the raw material waiting to be butchered. The machine suddenly shifted its internal gears with a sharp, mechanical click that sounded like a breaking bone, echoing loudly off the damp limestone walls like a gunshot in a tomb. The rhythmic, demonic pumping of the iron treadle stopped instantly. The bloody needle froze at the very apex of its upward stroke, dripping a single, heavy, viscous drop of crimson thread onto the oak surface below with a sickening slap. Drip. From deep inside the hollow, rusted metal casing of the sewing machine, a soft, dry, desperate scratching sound began to crawl. Like long, frantic fingernails scraping against sheet iron from the inside, begging to break free. Look down at your own shaking hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay steady if a dead machine started breathing inside its iron housing and whispered your name in the dark? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the edges of an inevitable, terrifying exit. As the scratching sound grew louder and more frantic, the unbleached cotton shroud on the table began to ripple from edge to edge in a violent spasm, lifting itself rigidly into the air as if a pair of invisible, skeletal shoulders were slowly sitting upright beneath the suffocating cloth, waiting for me. The coarse, unbleached cotton shroud lifted slowly, agonizingly off the scarred oak table, floating against gravity with a sickening, unnatural levity. Suspended in midair by an invisible, suffocating torso that radiated an intense, freezing aura of pure dread. Rising directly into the sickly amber glow of the hanging work lamp, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed across the limestone walls like tortured souls. No solid bones. No living flesh. Just a hollow, horrifying white column of heavy fabric taking on the distinct, menacing proportions of a mutilated man, swollen with emptiness. Have you ever experienced that complete, paralyzing, mind-shattering suspension of reality when something that was flat and lifeless suddenly stands up before your dilated eyes? Mimicking the shape of a human body with a terrifying, mocking precision that makes your stomach heave with nausea? People always talk about ghosts and specters as translucent wisps or shifting shadows that vanish the moment you turn on a bright light. They imagine that fear is something you can easily outrun or rationalize away. A harmless trick of a tired mind that dissolves into morning fog as soon as you step outside into the open, sunlit air. They do not know the soul-crushing, suffocating horror of standing trapped in a locked, subterranean basement while a blank burial garment fills itself out with a heavy, invisible presence that wants to consume you. Towering menacingly over your workbench like an executioner. They do not know what it feels like when the empty shroud turns its featureless, terrifying head directly toward you in the dark. And silently waits for you to break under the pressure and scream. The fabric at the top of the shroud parted slightly with a dry, ripping sound. A pair of hands pushed outward from beneath the coarse cotton weave with violent, jerky movements. Pale, corpse-like skin. Stiff, rigid joints. Coated thickly from wrist to bloodless knuckle in dense layers of toxic blue tailor's chalk like powdered bone. The long fingers curled inward, flexing once, twice, with sickening, wet cracks. Testing the rusted joints as if they hadn't moved in 40 years of solitary rot. And then, from the hollow, echoing space inside the linen hood, a sound emerged that froze the blood in my veins. Not a human voice. Just the dry, rattling, death rattle scrape of stale air passing through a collapsed, decaying windpipe. Who, CKH. Think about how deeply and blindly we trust the permanence of our own physical bodies. Believing that bone and muscle are solid, enduring realities that can never be unmade, hollowed out, or replaced by a folded piece of burial cloth. We walk through our daily lives with an arrogant, foolish confidence. Trusting that our hands will always obey our will, our hearts will always beat in steady rhythm, and our names will always belong to us alone. We believe that death is something that happens to other people in other distant rooms. Neatly filed away behind locked municipal intake doors where we never have to look at it. Then a chalk-stained, corpse-like hand reaches out from an unassigned shroud to claim you. And you suddenly realize your own skin was just a temporary garment borrowed from the dark municipal supply closet, waiting to be reclaimed. The chalk-stained fingers gripped the edge of the cutting table with crushing, supernatural force. Their freezing, deathly pressure causing the solid oak to groan and splinter in agonizing protest. The invisible figure leaned forward, bringing the suffocating white cotton hood down within inches of my frozen face, invading my space with absolute malice. The overwhelming stench of fresh formaldehyde, rotting flesh, and damp earth filled my nose and mouth instantly. So sharp, toxic, and heavy that it burned my lungs and made my eyes water with blinding pain. Then, from the absolute black void beneath the linen, a low, rasping, razor-sharp whisper brushed directly against my ear like a cold blade. Asterisk, you measured too short, Carter. The feet are hanging over the edge. Asterisk. Look down at your own shaking hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep working if a corpse wearing your own profession stood up from the dead and told you your final calculations were off by an inch? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the bleeding edges of an inevitable, terrifying exit. Before I could stumble backward or draw breath, the overhead workshop lights snapped off completely with a sharp, metallic click. Plunging the entire sub-basement into absolute, suffocating, pitch-black darkness where something was waiting for me in the void. The absolute, impenetrable darkness swallowed the sub-basement whole in a vicious, crushing gulp. Thick. Heavy. Suffocatingly dense, pressing down like a physical slab of lead. I couldn't see my own hand even inches from my dilated, terrified face. My ankles felt instantly paralyzed, locked in a vice of pure terror. The wet shroud had dropped off the table and bound itself violently, tightly around my boots with a malignant grip. Like freezing, wet iron bands squeezing the circulation out of my feet. From the pitch-black, yawning corridor outside the workshop, the heavy metal gurney began to roll closer with agonizing slowness. Scrape. Thud. Scrape. Thud. Have you ever experienced that overwhelming, soul-crushing dread when you are trapped in total, inescapable blackness, listening to the relentless approach of something heavy and monstrous that you cannot see, yet know is coming for your throat? People always talk about fear of the dark as a childish, foolish imagination. A harmless remnant of ancient instincts that vanishes the moment an electric switch is flipped or a sulfur match is struck. They imagine that rational thought is an impenetrable shield against the void. They believe that as long as your eyes are wide open, you can defend yourself against whatever lurks in the unseen shadows. They do not know the paralyzing, sanity-destroying reality of standing completely blind in a subterranean murder room while an unseen gurney rolls toward your exact workspace. Following a carved track etched into the concrete that only the dead and the damned know how to navigate. They do not know what it feels like when the darkness itself begins to press inward against your ribs, crushing your lungs until every breath is an agonizing struggle for survival. I gripped the splintered edge of the oak workbench with both hands until my muscles screamed. My knuckles turned corpse white and bloodless. The rubber-tired wheels of the unseen stretcher kept moving forward through the dark, steady, rhythmic, and utterly relentless. Passing smoothly through the open doorway. Stopping dead right beside my trembling stool, bathing me in its freezing aura. Then a voice spoke directly out of the terrifying void. My own voice, horribly distorted. Flat. Monotone. Devoid of all human warmth or life. File 04. Subject Carter. Measurement complete. I tried to unleash a desperate, deafening scream of pure horror. Not a single sound escaped my choked, collapsing throat. The chalk-stained, bone-hard fingers suddenly reached out from the pitch blackness and clamped brutally around my defenseless neck. Ice cold, like fingers of a corpse. Hard as unyielding stone. Pressing down into my flesh with absolute, mathematical, murderous precision. Think about how painfully fragile our sense of identity is when stripped of light, warmth, and movement. Believing naively that who we are is permanently defined by our fleeting thoughts, our memories, and our safe reflections in a bedroom mirror. We walk through well-lit rooms and assume our petty existence is permanent and untouchable by the abyss. We forget that we are only ever a single, shallow breath away from the dark. Then a hand made of cold mountain air, death, and municipal dust finds your throat in the dead of the night. And you realize your name was only ever pencil lead on cheap paper, just waiting to be viciously erased forever. The suffocating pressure on my crushing windpipe intensified exponentially. My vision flared violently with blinding flashes of deep, bruised purple and sickly gray. The old iron steam pipes overhead began to hiss with a demonic fury. Hiatus. The nightmare sound of 1976 Philadelphia flooded the room, tearing at my eardrums. Distant, violent rain lashing savagely against iron street grates. Police sirens wailing far above the pavement like dying animals. The relentless, metallic scraping of steel shears cutting effortlessly through coarse wool. And right beside my terrified ear, the vintage Singer machine started running again in the pitch dark with a sickening roar. Whir. Pulling my frozen body toward the gleaming, bloody needle inch by inch into the dark. Hashtag Chapter 8, The Needle and the White Cloth. The relentless, ear-splitting whir of the vintage Singer machine filled the pitch-black, suffocating room with a terrifying mechanical fury. Clack. Whir. Clack. Each agonizing revolution of the heavy flywheel sounded precisely like the deafening ticking of a giant grandfather clock counting down the final, bloody seconds of a terminal death sentence. I couldn't pull my paralyzed boots free from the frozen stone floor. The heavy, wet bands of cotton shroud had twisted cruelly around my ankles like living serpents, binding me to the stone with bone-crushing force like an anchor chain dropped into a murky, bottomless harbor. Have you ever experienced that desperate, clawing, lung-shredding panic when you realize with absolute horror that you are no longer standing on firm ground, but rather being reeled into a grinding mechanical apparatus against your violently thrashing will? People always talk about entrapment as something purely physical, being locked behind rusted iron bars, trapped in a sinking car, or pinned beneath a fallen wooden beam. They imagine that as long as your limbs are free, you can fight, claw, and punch your way out of any corner. They do not know the helpless, soul-destroying terror of being caught in an invisible, malevolent current, pulled forward not by muscle, but by the relentless, demonic rhythm of a machine that treats your fragile existence as an unfinished, disposable hem. They do not know what it feels like when the heavy fabric wrapping your legs begins to tighten like a tourniquet, inch by agonizing inch, drawing your body toward a razor-sharp needle you cannot see in the pitch dark. My trembling hands scrambled frantically across the rough, splintered surface of the oak cutting table, desperate for salvation. My fingers searching blindly for the heavy steel tailor's shears to defend myself. Instead, my palms slammed flat against the cold, wet, greasy metal of the intake card, sticking to my skin. The dark ink was still fresh and viscous, smearing across my trembling skin like wet charcoal and gore. The machine's internal gear mechanism shifted again with a sharp, violent, bone-snapping metallic snap. The rhythmic were abruptly stopped, leaving a heavy vacuum in the air. Absolute, crushing silence rushed back into the damp sub-basement with the weight of a falling avalanche. A silence so absolute, suffocating, and heavy that I could hear the frantic, erratic, deafening thud of my own heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to break free. Think about how much we take for granted in the quiet, fragile moments between one heartbeat and the next. Believing naively that silence is peaceful, a natural pause that allows us to catch our breath and steady our frayed nerves before the next task begins. We welcome the quiet, thinking it means the storm has passed and the lurking danger has retreated back into the dark. We forget that in places carved out beneath the city streets, silence is never an absence of threat or malice. It is simply the held breath before the final, horrifying drop into the abyss. A sudden, blinding, agonizing flare of amber light cut through the darkness like a butcher's knife. The hooded work lamp flickered violently back on above the scarred table, hissing with static. Its harsh, jaundiced glare made me squeeze my eyes shut in blinding pain, my retinas burning from the abrupt transition. When I forced my bleeding lids open, the cutting table was completely gone. The vintage Singer machine was gone, vanished into thin air. In their monstrous place stood a towering, suffocating wall of heavy, unbleached cotton bolts reaching all the way up to the shadowed, dripping rafters. And right in the center of the textile wall, a single, freshly tailored shroud hung suspended by a rusting iron meat hook that pierced the fabric. My own initials, *JC*, were stitched in thick, wet, glistening crimson thread right across the center of the chest. Look down at your own shaking hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep trembling if you saw your own initials embroidered in blood onto the final garment hanging in an empty, blood-soaked room? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the bleeding edges of an inevitable exit. Before my shattered mind could process the sheer impossibility of the transformation, the heavy iron door of the intake chute behind me began to rattle violently and uncontrollably once more, demanding entrance. The heavy iron door of the intake chute shook with a violent, agonizing, ear-splitting metallic rattling that echoed mercilessly off the damp, weeping limestone walls like a string of gunshots. Rattle, bang, rattle. It sounded with terrifying clarity as if someone, or something, on the floor above was throwing their full, crushing weight against the rusted latch, trying to force something massive, struggling, and unnatural down the steep gravity chute before the intake lock could ever engage. Have you ever experienced that sudden, heart-stopping spike of adrenaline when a security barrier you naively thought was securely locked begins to give way under an unseen, malevolent force? People always talk about physical security as a reliable guarantee: thick iron doors, heavy padlocks, and bolted chutes designed to keep the outside world where it belongs. They imagine that as long as the hardware is solid, nothing unauthorized can ever cross the threshold of safety. They do not know the gut-twisting, lung-collapsing panic of watching a municipal chute rattle violently on its hinges, knowing with sickening dread that whatever is sliding down toward you is far too large to fit through the narrow opening, yet forcing its way through anyway with bone-crushing pressure. They do not know what it feels like when the metal begins to groan, shriek, and buckle under the horrific strain, as if the very foundations of the building were being torn apart from the inside out. I took a sharp, desperate step backward, my boots tangling briefly and violently in the fallen, blood-stained shroud before I violently caught my balance against the freezing, slime-coated stone wall. The deafening rattling reached an unbearable, blood-curdling crescendo that made my head ring. Then, with a sharp, explosive, terrifying snap that sounded like a breaking spine, the heavy iron latch sheared completely off the frame. A torrent of toxic gray dust and dried, rotting municipal paper poured out of the yawning mouth of the chute in a suffocating wave, followed not by a safe sink transit box, but by a horrific flood of old, blood-speckled ledgers, loose index cards, and yellowed coroner's reports detailing unspeakable deaths. They cascaded across the concrete floor in a chaotic, burying wave, completely covering my boots and trampling the sharp fragments of red wax from the earlier boxes into powder. Think about how stubbornly and blindly we cling to the dead records of our past, believing that every document we file, every form we sign, and every ledger we maintain forms an unshakable, eternal monument to our existence. We stack our papers neatly, we log our passing hours, and we tell ourselves that history is something we write safely with ink on harmless paper. We believe that our municipal records will outlive us, serving as a permanent, glowing testament to the honest work we did while we were here in the light. Then an avalanche of forgotten, rotting files buries your floor in the dead of the night, and you realize the past isn't a monument at all, it's an incoming tide of corpses. I knelt down slowly on trembling knees, brushing the thick, choking layer of dead dust off the top document that had landed right at the tips of my boots. It wasn't a standard modern intake report. It was an ancient, handwritten ledger page, yellowed with age and stained with dark circles, dated 40 years before I had ever set foot in this cursed sub-basement. At the very top of the page, written in neat, elegant, yet chillingly familiar copperplate script, was a name I recognized instantly with a wave of absolute horror. Superintendent J. Carter. And right below it, in the column marked Status. Asterisk unresolved. Awaiting final measurement, asterisk. Look down at your own shaking hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep turning the yellowed pages if you found your own name entered into a logbook written decades before you were even born? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the bleeding edges of an inevitable, terrifying exit. Before I could pick up the cursed ledger from the floor, the single iron meat hook holding the hanging shroud high on the textile wall began to sway back and forth in the dead, freezing air like a pendulum marking out my final moments. The single, rusted meat hook groaned hideously under the crushing weight of the hanging shroud, its corroded iron shank swinging slowly, sickeningly back and forth in the heavy, stagnant, corpse-scented air of the sub-basement. Screech, screech. The sound scraped viciously against my raw eardrums like coarse steel wool pulled slowly across exposed, dry bone until it set my teeth on edge. Have you ever experienced that agonizing, stomach-churning suspense when an object hanging in an empty, blood-soaked room begins to move entirely on its own, as if caught in a freezing draft of death that no living soul else can feel? People always talk about wind and air currents as the sole, comforting explanations for movement in enclosed, tight spaces. They imagine that every sway, every shift, and every vibration must have a logical, physical cause tied neatly to ventilation shafts or cracked open windows. They do not know the suffocating, mind-shattering terror of standing trapped in a deep sub-basement with no vents, no windows, and absolute dead air, watching a burial garment swing with terrifying, increasing momentum straight toward where you stand paralyzed. They do not know what it feels like when the empty sleeves of a death shroud begin to reach outward with malicious intent, stretching unnaturally as if trying to brutally embrace the next breathing victim in their path. I didn't try to run frantically toward the heavy iron door. I knew with chilling certainty that the exit was completely useless. The monstrous avalanche of rotting ledgers had already piled high against the frame, burying the threshold beneath decades of municipal paper and forgotten graves. Instead, I stood frozen, watching the swinging shroud draw closer with hypnotic horror, its coarse, unbleached white fabric brushing violently against the towering walls of cotton bolts with a dry, rustling hiss like slithering serpents. And then, cutting sharply through the rhythmic, screeching agony of the iron hook, a terrifying new sound echoed down from the dark, open stone stairwell lurking behind the workshop. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Heavy leather heels clicking mercilessly hard against the descending stone steps like a death march. Clack, clack, clack. Think about how deeply and foolishly we rely on the comforting illusion of believing we are completely alone in our isolation, trusting blindly that our hidden workspaces are safe from the intrusion of both the living and the dead alike. We lock ourselves away in dark basements, deep archives, and hidden back rooms, convinced that distance from the noisy world equates to absolute safety from its harsh judgment. We tell ourselves that no one knows where we are hiding, no one cares what we are measuring, and no one will ever come down to check our grim work. Then you hear slow footsteps descending the forbidden stairs during a night shift when nobody else is scheduled, and you realize with a jolt of pure horror that isolation isn't protection at all, it's an invitation to slaughter. The heavy footsteps stop dead right at the bottom of the stone stairwell, just beyond the ragged edge of the hooded work lamp's sickly amber pool of light. A long, distorted, grotesque shadow stretched across the damp concrete floor, cast cruelly by the dim corridor light from above. The unmistakable shadow of a man wearing a tall, stiff-brimmed municipal inspector's hat and carrying a heavy, blood-stained leather ledger tucked tightly under his arm. The swinging shroud abruptly halted its violent motion, hanging dead still in the freezing air, pointing its lifeless finger directly at the newcomer. Then the towering figure at the very edge of the light raised a black-gloved hand and tapped twice against the slime-coated stone wall with sickening force. Asterisk tap. Tap asterisk. Look down at your own shaking hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep steady if a visitor stepped right out of the shadows and asked to inspect your final tally? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the bleeding edges of an inevitable, terrifying exit. As the mysterious figure stepped forward out of the dark into the amber glow, revealing a rotting face identical to my own corpse-like reflection, the workshop lights flickered once with a dying gasp and died completely, plunging us into eternal dark. The absolute, suffocating darkness that followed the sudden flicker of the overhead lamp wasn't empty or benign. It was dense, terrifyingly heavy, and smelled intensely of cold, stagnant river water, copper, and fresh, toxic printer's ink mixed with the stench of decay. I stood completely motionless in the pitch black, my ears straining with agonizing panic to catch the sound of ragged, wet breathing just inches away from my frozen face. Have you ever experienced that staggering, soul-crushing disorientation when you come face to face with your own rotting reflection, only to realize with paralyzing horror that the figure standing opposite you has an independent, malicious agenda, a stolen history, and a gruesome destination entirely separate from your own? People always talk about mirrors as passive glass surfaces that simply bounce back whatever harmless light happens to hit them. They imagine that human identity is a fixed, single-channel reality anchored securely and permanently inside one's own skull. They do not know the dizzying, sanity-shattering terror of standing blind in the dark while your exact double speaks to you with a voice that sounds like dry paper scraping across a jagged tombstone. They do not know what it feels like when the person wearing your own skin hands you an open, blood-soaked ledger and demands you sign your own death warrant in the audit column. A sudden, violent scratch of a wooden match flared blindingly in the absolute blackness. The small, sick, yellow flame illuminated a pair of corpse-cold, gloved fingers holding the burning stick. The flame rose steadily, casting long, jittery, claw-like shadows against the weeping limestone walls as the figure holding it lifted a heavy brass hurricane lamp from the floor. It was me. Or rather, an impeccably tailored, flawlessly preserved, yet dead version of myself wearing the exact same gray work apron stained with gore, the same steel-rimmed glasses, and the same expression of weary, unyielding calculation. The double didn't look at me with raw malice or wild anger. He looked at me with the detached, chilling, professional indifference of an executioner reviewing a late shipment of meat. He held out the heavy leather ledger in his left hand, tapping a long, pale finger against an empty line at the bottom of the page. "Sign the final tally, Carter," he said, his voice echoing with a strange, dual, metallic resonance, as if two rotting throats were speaking simultaneously through the same windpipe. Asterisk, the intake lift is waiting for the payload, and the night shift officially ends at midnight. Asterisk. Think about how stubbornly and blindly we cling to the comforting belief that our lives belong exclusively to us, convinced that our choices, our errors, and our final balance sheets are private matters managed entirely by our own free will. We log our passing hours, we correct our petty mistakes, and we tell ourselves that we have plenty of time left to balance our books before the ledger is closed for good. We believe that our existence is an ongoing story authored by our own hands. Then an auditor steps out of the dark carrying 40 years of your own uncollected paperwork and unpunished sins, and you realize your life was always just an inventory managed by a cold, uncaring master. I didn't reach for the pen. My fingers remained stiff and paralyzed at my sides, my boots still bound cruelly to the floorboards by the heavy, choking coils of unbleached cotton. The flame of the hurricane lamp began to flicker and turn a sickly, phosphorescent blue, casting a corpse-like hue over our faces. The solid walls of the sub-basement started to contract with terrifying speed, the limestone blocks sliding inward with slow, grinding groans of tortured stone that threatened to crush the workbench into splinters. The double smiled, a thin, cruel, humorless crease of the lips that revealed too many teeth, and dropped the burning match directly onto the towering pile of dry ledgers at our feet. Look down at your own shaking hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep holding a pen if the paper beneath them suddenly caught fire from an invisible, demonic spark? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the bleeding edges of an inevitable, terrifying exit. As the aggressive blue flames raced wildly across the concrete floor toward my trapped boots, the heavy iron intake door behind the double burst wide open with a deafening crash, flooding the suffocating room not with fresh air, but with the freezing, roaring, violent sound of an incoming tide of blood. The aggressive blue flames racing frantically across the concrete floor didn't scorch the wooden boards or leave a mark. They vanished the precise moment they touched the sharp edges of the scattered, blood-soaked ledgers, dissolving into a fine, pale ash that rose into the air like drifting, radioactive snow. And then came the water, brutal and unyielding. Not a simple trickle from a leak, and not a burst pipe. It poured through the open intake door in a solid, glass-clear, crushing wall of freezing, salt-choked river water, instantly filling the sub-basement with the heavy, choking, death-laden scent of the open, drowning sea and rotting weed. Have you ever experienced that complete, breathtaking, soul-shattering surrender when the environment you spent your entire fragile life trying to control suddenly violently reclaims itself, washing away every wall, every table, and every carefully measured, desperate rule? People always talk about final moments as scenes of dramatic struggle, fighting desperately against the current, kicking wildly toward a distant surface, or screaming bloody murder for help in an empty room. They imagine that fear is a weapon you can wield effectively until the very end. They do not know the quiet, heavy, suffocating peace that settles over your freezing bones when the dark water rises past your chest and you finally stop trying to keep your footing on the slippery stone. They do not know what it feels like when the chaos of the world simply dissolves into total silence, leaving nothing behind except the steady, rhythmic, demonic hum of a machine running entirely underwater. The double didn't flinch or move as the freezing tide hit his shins with the force of a battering ram. He simply stood beside the workstation, holding the brass hurricane lamp aloft while the black water swirled fiercely around his boots without extinguishing the unnatural blue flame trapped inside the glass. He looked at me directly one final time. Not with pity, and not with malicious triumph. Just with the cold, dead look of a master craftsman acknowledging that the bloody work was finally done. The measurements were exact, Carter, he whispered, his voice blending seamlessly with the roaring rush of the incoming, choking water. Asterisk, every inch accounted for. Every hem closed permanently. Asterisk. The water rose rapidly to my chin, lifting my limp body effortlessly off the floor, freeing my boots from the heavy, suffocating coils of unbleached cotton that had bound me all night like a trap. I didn't struggle against the dark. I let go of the edge of the workbench and sank into the void. Think about how much vital energy we waste trying to outrun the inevitable, spending our decades cutting, measuring, and stitching together lives we foolishly believe we own, terrified that someone else might check our math. We worry obsessively about the unwritten pages, the missed deadlines, and the unfinished seams, believing that if we just work harder, we can somehow delay the final audit. We forget that every mortal tailor eventually lays down their bloody shears. And that the burial garments we spend our lives making were never meant to be worn by us. I drifted upward, floating effortlessly through the dark, freezing water toward the open intake shaft overhead like a corpse rising to the surface. The vintage Singer machine remained heavy at the bottom, its iron flywheel turning smoothly beneath the surface, stitching the final white shroud with invisible, blood-soaked thread. As my head finally broke the surface of the water, the suffocating darkness instantly gave way. Not to warm daylight. Not to the harsh glare of a work lamp. But to the quiet, familiar, yet chilling glow of a single desk lamp resting on an empty oak table in an upper room where the fire in the fireplace had finally burned down to a bed of gray, silent ash. Look down at your own shaking hands right now, while you still have the fading warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep moving before the room goes completely quiet and the needle finally stops? We are all just temporary tailors stitching together the bleeding edges of an inevitable exit. I closed the bloody ledger, blew out the dying flame, and left the workshop floor to the dark.